Mark.
Mark, with a K or a C?
With a C.
Congratulations.
So we'll head on down this way. And like Dave said, I live in this house that we'll pass on the right. There's, we'll talk a little, 250 to 300 acres as late as the 1940s. And right now it's split in two and it's still being farmed, but the this sort of half of it over here belongs to the Chase family, and they've got it all land trusted in the Chase family land trust. And the farm over here belongs to a local physician from Barrington named Charlie McCoy, and he's probably got about 140 acres and maybe 120, 140 acres over on that side. And we'll cross over it a couple of times, but the Massachusetts-Rhode Island boundary runs right through the middle of that stream, or that pond that's over here, and through a big cedar tree that you'll see at the end of our driveway, and a big rock that's just past that, so it kind of cuts across our driveway. And it makes for some interesting jurisdictional conversations periodically, but we pay $36 a year in property taxes to the town of Swansea, for example. They always want us to pay quarterly, and we always want to pay annually, so, you know, just kind of funny things mostly. But I'm happy to talk about the farm and kind of what's happening with that. I think the land transition and the way people think about using the land is just a huge part of the story from 8,000 years ago right up to now, because it's not been one thing or another. It's always been pretty dynamic situation. So, but that's kind of it for who's out here. And since the pandemic started, it's been really quiet. And you've probably been reading in the papers about the way the pandemic is changing how wildlife uses different areas. And even out here, as quiet as this has been for a long time, you can really, really see a noticeable difference in who's where and what they're doing, and you know, how much they have their guard up or don't, kinds of things. It's pretty fascinating to watch. But anyway, we'll just walk down here. Yeah, head right up, straight up, follow those folks, and we'll be right there.
Okay.
You can go up to the right there a little bit if you want. There's a couple of rocks for you to stand on. So this is what's called Margaret's Rock, and as Dave likes to point out, there's really only one mention of it in the historic record as being the place that Roger Williams came to, and the person that put that in her history is a little bit suspect as a historian on some other things. So she has a book that came out in the 1920s. It's kind of a local history of Warren that has a piece of it in here. But there have been a couple of other folks out from who know parts of the tribal history, and they feel like it's a pretty good bet that this was part of.
There's a man that wrote like an extension on the story, and he included her part of it in it, and it pretty much coincides with the tribal history.
Yeah, so it seems so the percentages of this being really being one of the important places are pretty high, is what I would say.
There's some places that we let the public know where are, and other places we know where it is. We tell people it's somewhere near that, so that they don't actually find it and vandalize it or something.
Yeah. So the Roger Williams Family Association got permission in 2011 to put up this marker, and their marker is accurate up to a point. It offers part of one version of the history of this place. And that story, and I'm sure some of you know it better than I would, but that story is that in 1636, after history of disputes with Puritan leadership, Roger Williams was threatened and kind of chased out of Massachusetts Bay, and he had prior connections with the Pokanoket here and Sawyed in particular, and there's a little story behind that I'll come back to in a minute. And he made his way in February of 1636 down to this spot, and the story that's been passed on is that when he arrived, he had some sort of bronchial illness that probably either was or turned into pneumonia, and he spent about a month at this location being nursed back to health by the people who were here for their winter camp. And that was Margaret, one of the wives of Sawyed, and we don't know what her given name was in the tribe. She just goes in the European record as Margaret. And Williams got better, and when he got better, he kind of wandered down to the Seekonk River, tried to set up camp on the east side, got chased off over the west side, and that became the start of the city of Providence and everything that followed from that. So what I usually tell people, and I'm a cultural historian by training, so not that counts for very much, but it kind of shapes how I think about what this place means and how to use it, or how to interpret it. So I don't have an objection to this particular history being here, but I don't like that it seems to encapsulate the entire history. This is what people who aren't thinking a lot about it come and read, and they're like, oh, this is cool, and they move on. The more comprehensive story is that the Pokanoket was one of the tribes within what are now called the Wampanoag, and this was one of their regular seasonal camps. The best guess that I have, based on conversations with a number of folks, is that most of the camp that was here was probably a late fall into winter camp, and the reason is we're not going to walk up into it. It's pretty overgrown and buggy right now, but if you are interested, you can see what's left of a little trail here. The animals still use it, and it goes up, and this particular piece of rock is actually the tail end of a very, very long spine of rock that goes for about a mile north and south and then dives back underground, right? And to the east of that spine, for almost half a mile right here, there's a bench probably 15 feet, 20 feet below the peak of this that runs alongside it, and then another drop off about another 10, 15 feet. And what that does is a few different things that if I were looking for a place to winter, this would be reasons that it would make a really good place. It's about as protected from winter weather as you can possibly be, just passively. Almost all of the bad storms are going to come out of the northwest, or some of them are going to come out of the northeast, and you've got protection. The prevailing winds through here and storms, the other three seasons, are almost all out of the southwest, and this gives a lot of protection to that. It's also, there's a military historian from Rhode Island, very interested in colonial history, named Jamie Warren, who's been out here to visit, and he's looked pretty extensively at the European and intertribal politics from the 1600s, 1700s. And his first comment when he was out here on a tour that David organized was that one of the other things that made this pretty desirable is it was really easily defensible, because it was, you could look off from the top up here and get a view of who's coming. You could get down behind it and defend yourself easily, because anybody coming towards you would have to come uphill through some brush. So that's the best guess, is that the encampment and the Witus, the housing that people used, were probably spread along there. So the apocryphal story is that Roger Williams was actually nursed back to health in the V of this rock with a lean-to over it. Get a fire going in there, the rock warms up, it would be pretty cozy. I've been out here 365 days a year. And in days when there are big snowstorms, and there is never snow in that V. Like, I've been here when the snow was up to my hips, like right here, and there's a line and the snow doesn't go into the V. So it's just an oddity of geology, but it's really, really incredibly protected.
Is there a permanent water source around here for the Indians?
There are several that are within, none of them like here, but there are several that are moving water that would be much more desirable, kind of about maybe a quarter of a mile over this way. And there's a big kettle hole, about not even a quarter, just very, we walked past it just coming over here.
Also, those two ponds that you say they're spring fed, they existed back
They're
then,
not,
those
they're,
springs?
it's questionable whether they're spring fed. They're hand dug, so they would not have existed.
But if the springs existed, we probably would
Yeah,
have water from
yeah,
that.
and
That's
there's
the best
little
water.
springs all over the place. Yeah.
This rock ledge, though, that Route 6 cuts through it, doesn't it? Like you can see a rock cut.
Well, if you
Yeah,
look
the
at some
nursing home.
aerial maps of this, what you see, you're right,
Yeah.
but what you see is that there's a whole series of about maybe 8 or 10 of these spines of rock that run north and south. So this is all glacial carving, right? And the way that they work here, what I find really fascinating about them is that this one kind of ends here, and obviously a chunk of it's broken off over the years, but it dives back underground. And when we walk out, 50 yards to the west, you'll see the start of another spine that comes up and then goes for a mile or so before it dives back down, maybe half a mile before it dives back down. So these 10 spines kind of go, one's up and the one next to it is down, and they kind of go for 10 or 15 miles north and south.
I'm sorry. So to orient me, which way we're...
This is north.
So,
Yeah.
so Johnson's farm, where there's a...
right there.
Okay, because there's a rock outcropping there.
That one's probably
so that's
part of another one of the spines.
Okay, so it's not this one.
Yeah, so these ridges run like north to south, basically.
Yeah, they call that
Oh, okay.
grinding rock or mortar rock,
Right,
and that's
okay.
the story there. Dave's
So
taking
they're going to
some
run
peaks over.
parallel.
Yeah.
That's where they would seasonally have ground the corn that they raised. I used to think that they did some of the actual farming here because for a variety of reasons, but I have no evidence of that. It just kind of, again, I think about it more in terms of if I were setting up, how to get food. There's some things that would make this pretty attractive.
Has anybody done an archaeological dig
They've
here,
been
or-
out gently looking, and the two problems. One is they've not found anything that would suggest going any further. And other than, there's people with metal detectors, kind of amateurs that are out all the time, and they find a lot of colonial artifacts. Another part of the backstory that I think a lot about, particularly
Before
now.
you get into the next part, has anyone brought ground penetrating radar up here?
If they have, I don't know about
That's
it.
expensive, but it's the best way to find
Yeah,
anything.
they've done, there's been professional archaeologists out, but the other thing is that the primary interesting spot that they would want to look at, and we'll walk past it, this is the reason I wanted to do this direction on the circle, is we'll walk past what is told to be a burial ground. But the way that burials happened is it would be pretty surprising if there were any recognizable artifacts
Right.
left from that, because
A
it's,
ground penetrating idea would prove or disprove that idea.
well, there might not be anything for a ground penetrating radar to hit, is what so it's all organic, it's probably all gone at this point. There's a very good chance. And part of the reason for that is that there would have been burial practices that were more traditional that might have resulted in things that could be traced and found even hundreds of years later. But 1616 to 1619, there's an epidemic
Right.
that hits really hard, and the best guesstimates are that somewhere between 50 and 90% of the native population right in this area died as a consequence of those infections. And it would have happened suddenly, it would have happened across ages, and what it did was disrupt the entire social fabric of the tribe. And the stories are that the deaths happened at a rapid enough pace, and enough people were sick around the people dying, that burial became, it didn't follow any particular pattern because people didn't have the resources or energy to do that. So the chances are pretty good that this burial area over here is more a burial area from that period than it is something more traditional. So with that, I mean, it's a little grotesque, but in some ways, but what it means is bodies would have just been put into a mass burial site
Right.
and decomposed, and that would have been close to 400 years ago now.
Yeah,
So
and that you're maybe less likely to have accoutrements for the afterlife, like bows
Exactly.
and arrows and stuff with them, where
Yeah.
the spear points and the arrowheads and stuff would show
Yep,
up with the
yep.
radar.
And there are arrowheads that you'll find, especially as the fields are plowed. So you find a lot of artifacts, but they're not organized in a way that makes this like a real dig or, you know, a particular thing.
I would think that bones wouldn't last very long in the acid nature of the soils around here either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is called, you came down Birch Swamp Road, and there's a couple of other aspects of the geology out here that are a consequence of the glaciers, but really matter for how the land works. But one is there's a lot of water movement through here, which would also go to your point, and it's really hard water, so bones would, you know, just calcium in the bones, they're gone, right? But the other thing is, I could show you back over in these farm fields or over at our house, is there's about 18 inches to 2 feet of pretty good topsoil most places, and then there's about 1 inch to 2 inches of clay, white and gray clay, white and blue clay, and then there's sand underneath that. But there are big areas where there's just a gravel pile and then sand. There's areas where there's this clay, and there's areas where there's slab. So you never know quite what you're going to run into. It's really very spotty. So my best guess from what I've heard from geologists is this was probably sort of the end of one of the glaciers, and it just, as it receded, it just left random stuff, and so there's a hugely random nature to the way the soil is out here too.
I'm thinking back then that might have been deeper too, because I'm looking at the rocks. That
Yeah.
one, the shape of it and the way it's
Yep.
so embedded,
Yeah, this probably came
was
out.
probably glacier. These two probably broke off of there.
Yeah, yeah. And you can see there's some splits here that this big central piece is going to break down over the next 100 years too, I would think. Yeah, it's just going to continue. There's a little bit of a seepage of water coming out of the V of that as well.
There are some really good books available through the library that I read over the winter about stone and the history of stone, and it explains about how the soils were formed
Yep.
and everything following the glaciers. So if anybody's interested in deeper reading on that.
The ant lions like it over
Bristol
here.
Library, right, Bonnie?
Yeah.
Huh?
Bristol Library, right?
Yeah.
A lot of
There's
ants out
also
here.
some fossil in the stone.
Yeah, this is
It's a good example of what's sometimes called pudding stone.
Yeah. Another thing that has been kind of interesting to me, I worked a lot through high school and college and a little bit afterwards doing landscaping work and did a lot of stone wall construction. So I'm pretty in love with stone walls. And what I was always told is growing up is that most of the New England stone walls happened after European arrival, and they were the European settlers, and they tended to bring the traditions from wherever they came from in Europe. So, you know, British or English farmers built their walls one way, Irish people that came over built them another way. If you came from Germany or wherever, you built them a third. So they were all. But what I think is more complex and interesting version of this story, and seems to be true, is that a lot of the stone walls in this area were actually constructed not only by European settlers, but also by native people who'd been here for years. And they did it largely to protect things they valued from the animals of the Europeans who were moving in. So I don't want your pigs, I don't want your cows, because they're going to strip out forests that we use.
A lot of contention happened over it.
Yep. Yeah. So a lot of the
Wandering
stone
animals.
walls you're going to see were built by the tribal groups that were in here. The other thing that I've been interested in for quite some time is sort of who owns the land. You know, that's been a perennial question since King Philip's War in this area, and the Mason family that moved onto this farm in the 1680s basically got 350, 400 acres of land is a spoil of King Philip's War. And the tribe that was here, keep in mind they've been decimated by this epidemic, so they're probably at 25% of their original strength to begin with. King Philip's War happens, and the survivors, the native people, indigenous people who survived that war, are on penalty of imprisonment or death, told that they can't use their language, practice their customs, and those laws stayed on the books until the 1940s.
And most importantly, the reason why people have so often not even heard the word Pokanoket is because our name was outlawed. They would put any male 14 or over who claimed to be Pokanoket to death.
Yep, yeah, it was very harsh. And so what happened, my understanding, and you might know more about this, is that many of the tribal members that survived the war were sold into slavery in the Caribbean, or
Bermuda.
they escaped up to join some of the tribes in what's now southern Maine, right? And
Yeah,
they just,
we hid out with other tribes
yeah,
if we weren't.
the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy,
If we weren't amongst the ones that were unlucky enough to be sent off into slavery, we hid amongst neighboring tribes, and even, like you said, some of them went up that far too.
So one of
But
the things,
the whole Federation of Territory that the Master Sawyed was the leader of, it was huge.
Mm-hmm.
It was huge. It went all the way up to like the New Hampshire and Vermont border, because he intermarried with other tribes and stuff like that. So there was allies. So it was all part of the looser federation. So it went way up that way. It went a little ways into upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
The only tribe in the area that wasn't actually part of the federation was the Narragansett.
and they had a long history of disputes with the Narragansett. The Narragansett were less impacted by that epidemic I talked about, meant that their political power increased dramatically afterwards. And part of the Pokanoket interest in supporting Roger Williams was that they wanted to have him as an ally against the Narragansett going forward. So, there's a much more dynamic political reality to all
The
this.
tribal histories that we've been told say that they originally befriended the Pilgrims for a couple of reasons, including that one, but also because we had a tradition of taking in other groups. And also we looked at these people and said to ourselves, they're not going to survive if they don't learn how to live here.
Yeah, and I sometimes wonder how, looking back, how if those same choices would be made.
I think if he had,
Down the line.
I think if Osimiquin had realized there were so many of them would just keep coming, and the next batches of them wouldn't have the same religious and political thought as the first batch, he probably wouldn't have. I mean, because in the end it just further decimated the tribe.
Well, they also wouldn't have that personal connection to the tribe that the original settlers
Yeah.
did.
Well, even the second generation of the original settlers lost the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they hadn't personally been rescued, basically, and so they didn't have that feeling of obligation toward the tribe that the first generation did.
So I would imagine if you're in England, people are telling you, hey, you know what, the folks who live here, they're pretty friendly, they're helping us. You can come over. You're right, if they said they're trying to kill us all, you're right, they would have stayed home.
Well, it's actually, the thing is, what starts to emerge, and there's a guy named Francis Jennings has a really good history of intertribal politics with Europe from contact forward. And then there's another historian, David Silverstein, who has a book called This Land is Their Land, that's 2017, 2018 book that came out that's really, really superb and is explicitly about this area for the most part. And what the historians have described, and what I think some of the tribal stories that have been reclaimed describe, is much more small-scale complexity and negotiating for position and power within European groups, within tribal groups, and they're being human beings, kind of trying to do what they need to do to live the life they imagine for themselves, right? So with the Pilgrims, what you've got in Massachusetts is actually Pilgrims and Puritans. They're not the same group. They're opposed to each other, right? And the tribes realize that, and they start playing them off against each other. But they realize that, and they start playing the tribes off against each other. And so you all of a sudden end up with this really, really complicated set of politics.
I have a friend named Connie who is very interested in the history of the area, and she came to the tribe and asked to learn the proper history. But she also has studied the first colonists, and she calls the coming together of those two groups the first great synthesis, because it was the first time groups from such diverse cultures actually had tried to work together. And that worked really well until Winslow died and Osimiquin died. Winslow's son, I can never remember his first name,
Josiah.
Pokanokets, which is what King Philip's name was, Metacom of the Pokanoket. They hated each other. They just never got along, couldn't understand why their fathers were friends, and so.
Yeah.
And by that time, the settlers were just, they weren't negotiating for land anymore, they were just taking what they wanted. So that's when Pokanokets made his decision that he needed to try to drive them out.
Right. So, and the people you just named, I doubt very much that they spoke as a singular voice representing everybody that they politically represented, right? So, we probably don't want to go too far down that part of the history for right now. I mean, I'd be happy to. But, and the reason I'm suspicious is not that I think he did anything terribly unethical or underhanded, but the mythology of him is that he was this peacemaker, and he was one of the people in this group that really had this vision of sort of a unified community of some kind of synthesis. In fact, if you look at what he's doing, is he spends most of his time traveling from group to group, playing them off against each other, in the interests of his vision.
He definitely had different political and religious opinions.
Yeah,
than the rest
and
of
I, you know, and good on him. He's being who he is, doing what he's doing. Like, that's what he's here for, right? But that makes for. So I imagine that Chief Massasoit, even though he spoke about trying to
Massasoit is the title. His name was Osimiquin.
or Osimiquin.
And that's one thing that really bothers us, is when people just assume Massasoit was his name and don't bother to learn it. It's a title that meant great leader.
So, but when he is trying to call for peace, he's doing it strategically because he thinks their numbers are so decimated that if they get into a conflict, they're going to lose what little they have left.
That's why Equinic Island changed hands, because originally it was Pokanoket. A portion in the very north end was still under Pokanoket influence after they basically ceded it to the Narragansett, because the Narragansett were working with the Pequot and could have come in and wiped out the entire Pokanoket. So it was decided that there's water between us, and we'll let that be the barrier that keeps them at bay. So even though the Narragansetts were principally the other side of the bay, the Pokanokets gave up Equinic in order to survive.
Can you expand your attitudes towards Roger?
Well, I think it's not so much about him as a person as it is about the way the histories of him have been constructed. And they're largely, he is establishing a colony that is the precursor to the Bill of Rights, particularly religious freedom, but a lot of civil political freedoms alongside that. That he does the Native American alphabet, publishes that book, and that's interpreted for years and years as evidence of his very close interpersonal relationships with the tribal groups in the area, and his deep affection, and through the lens of kind of seeing him as sort of a more modern person than I think he was, we sort of say, well, if you can understand somebody's language and that means you can understand their story, then you begin to have empathy and compassion, so you're a peacemaker, right? And what I see him actually doing in the historic record is, when it's in the interest of his colony to play against the Pokanoket, he plays against them. And he does it very, very subtly. He's a brilliant diplomat. Let's keep moving just down the rest of the path, and I'll show you where the burial area is thought to have been.
If Margaret was alive today, what would he say?
I've stayed in better places.
So this area right here, where it kind of slopes down just very gently, if you walk in, which you're welcome to, you'll see that there's actually a little bit of a basin, kind of a little bit of a depression, very gradual, goes on for a ways and then comes back up. And my guess is that depression area, because it's pretty symmetrical, it's more than likely human-made, right? And that if the written record back to Virginia, what's her name's book?
Baker.
Virginia Baker, her book, is that if you walk 250 paces to the west from the mouth of Margaret's Rock, you'll come to the traditional burial ground. This is about 250 paces. But it could be here in what's now wooded. It could be on the other side of the stone wall in what's, watermelon field that the Clegg family's farming. It could be made up.
Does that fill up with water at all?
No, it's got some drainage into it.
The story was actually told by Big Thunder, Penobscot Indian who came here in 1904 as part of a tour that a minister was doing that went all the way out to Oregon. But he spent about a week here and apparently used a map that someone had of the original Pokanoket territory here. The map has since been lost. And he spent a good deal of time looking for not only the grave sites, but also a place where a good deal of wampum had been buried. Never found it and left the area. And that's about 115 years ago. And that's pretty much it.
The way I think about this is there are a lot of days I'm out here with my dogs for a walk and I don't think twice about it. I just walk past and it's whatever my thoughts or birds or whatever. But there is other times when I'm walking past it that it's really something to sit back and reflect on, whether it's objectively the burial ground or just kind of a metaphor or a myth. There's a truth to it of who lived here and what happened to them that even thinking about that can represent. And I've found that particularly poignant since the pandemic started here, because this is a 17th century pandemic is what kind of hit them, and it lasted 3 years. So.
What is it? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
There you go. Yeah. Just going to pause here for a second. So this is another one of these apocryphal possibilities that I like to think is probably true. So you can see there's a couple of parallel depressions here that go on for quite some distance. There's a lot of little depressions you'll find in the woods where a big tree went over in a storm and then it took out another tree and another tree. So you can see, it's not unusual to find something like this. And then the trees have deteriorated over decades, and what's left is this sort of ridge with the two depressions. But one of the other stories is that there was just about where you turned into our property, there was a stagecoach house that was part of the road from Warren up to Worcester, and that part of it ran through here. So one thought is, and I think it's kind of fun, but I also have zero evidence to back it up other than the depressions themselves, is that this might have been at one point where that road was, and then things have just kind of grown up into it. So. For those of you who do like rocks, one of my favorite rocks on the whole farm is this big one that you're standing on. It's just massive, goes right across the road, or right across the path, which is, how they move that is sort of a miracle. But you can see how far down this is and what a mucky.
When was all that done?
The Mason family got this in the 1680s and did get it as a charter from the king in the aftermath of the war, when the land was being, the sort of spoils of the war were being divvied up. And their family, their heirs stayed on this until 1940. And in 1940-ish, the Chase family bought them out, continued as a dairy farm until the 1970s. And then dairy farming across the United States sort of collapsed in on itself, largely as a consequence of federal agricultural policy. And the Chase family started doing sort of market gardening, you know, trying of chickens and vegetables and different things, and it never quite caught. It never quite recovered from that. And but part of the gain, as messy as it is getting, and it's turning into more of a bog than it is a pond on the other end, is that I also saw 2 otters in here this winter, which were the first time I've seen them ever on this property, so that was pretty cool.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I guess
She
my
loves
kids are here, so I
otters.
can try to see them. Otter is my totem
What kind of
animal, river
What kind of
otter.
animal did we see when we walked out?
That was a groundhog, woodchuck.
How would you maintain